keep it real with ya.
Hey guys, it's me, Minu. I'm gonna apologize in advance because I did not plan to make this video as soon as I'm making it now. I was at least gonna make this video like a few weeks later or maybe a month later. I'm not entirely sure, but I wasn't planning to make it now. But I felt like I had to because on Friday, I literally just basically healed through a trauma during trauma therapy. So I'm like, look, I gotta tell y'all about this. This is crazy. Sadie likes to say, hey, you wanna say something? So what I wanted to talk to you guys today about is about trauma, complex trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and the process of healing from it. So in my video about bipolar disorder, I did mention a couple things that anybody watching would be like, damn, that was pretty fucked up. That was pretty traumatic, Minu. And I'm like, yeah, it was. But I didn't want to go too deep into the trauma and the effects of trauma and like all of my different traumas. And I'm not going to go into all of my different traumas in this video either, but I'm going to talk more broadly about trauma and about healing from trauma. And maybe in another video, I might be able to talk deeply about the traumas. But the thing about traumas is that, what, Sadie? What? The thing about trauma is that it's not easy to talk about when you went through a traumatic experience. You're going to feel triggered. You're going to get upset when you're talking about it. So it's not something that's easy for me to just like go through the laundry list of all the things I've been through. So I'm not going to give you all of that. And I'm not going to trigger you by giving you all of that either. But I am going to talk about trauma and adverse experiences in a more broad term. So one of the first things I want to talk about is ACE, not asexual, ACE, adverse childhood experiences. And anybody who's a native English speaker can probably guess what that means. I'm going to link some websites down in the description, but I did print out some broader definitions of what adverse childhood experiences are. So basically, adverse childhood experiences are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. ACEs can include violence, abuse, growing up in a family with mental health issues or substance abuse problems. Toxic stress from ACE can change brain development. So that's a big thing is that you got to understand. Trauma changes your brain. It is not just something that happens and you upset about it. It changes the way your brain functions. That's the biggest thing. If you don't remember anything from this video, the biggest thing is that trauma changes your brain. So toxic stresses from ACEs can change brain development and affect how the body responds to stress. So it's not just you mad up here, but your whole body is involved when you get triggered by a traumatic event. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, something that I was going to talk about today, but I guess I'm going to talk about in the next video. Mental illness, something you know I have, and substance misuse and adulthood, something that I don't really have, but if you ask the average person, they'd say I take way too many pills. But that's another video. Sadie, what do you want? Why are you meowing at me from afar? What, baby? Now, preventing adverse childhood experiences is very hard because, I mean, like, let's be honest. If you are Black or Latin, or if you are growing up in poverty, the likelihood of you having some kind of adverse childhood experience is just much higher. You know, it's more likely that your parents might have some kind of substance abuse problem. It's more likely that your parents would have very authoritarian parenting styles that may lead them to hit you a lot more. And sometimes they might go too far when they're disciplining you. It's more likely that you're going to be exposed to violence, whether it's marital violence, whether it's abuse of the children, whether it's gang violence that your family just gets involved in because this is the neighborhood you live in. So it's really hard to prevent. But something that I always tell people in my family is like, if you're a conscious parent, and a lot of people aren't, a lot of people have kids and they're just like, whatever. But if you're a conscious parent and you're really thinking about how what you do affects your child, you can take steps to try and prevent that by, you know, if your child seems to have a mental illness, you know, getting them help getting them to see a therapist or even just a child counselor or whatever. You can think about the way you speak to them, think about the way you discipline them. You can think about the type of things that you do in front of your child, whether that is drinking, smoking, you know, you having a bunch of different people coming in and out of the house who might, and you might end up exposing your child to maybe some type of sexual abuse, you know. But if you're thinking about these things as a parent, you can kind of mitigate the risk of that because you are looking out for it. You're aware of it. You're not just trusting anybody in your family to come be around your kids, because most kids who get abused are abused by people they know. So just because that's your cousin Ran don't mean that he could never, ever in a million years even think to molest a child. He might do it. So don't think that just because they're your family members that they won't do it, because they will. But when you take preventative measures, you can lower the risk of things like depression, asthma, cancer, diabetes. Like, come on, y'all. Like, these are things you would never even think are related, but they are definitely related. You can reduce the potential that your child may become a smoker or be a heavy drinker. And you can prevent the fact that your child may pass on these different traumas and toxic situations onto their kids. So when you're a parent, when you decide to be a parent, you're not just thinking about your kid. You're thinking about your kid, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, because what you do with that child is going to set the stage for how they treat their own child. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't think about until their grandchild is born, and then suddenly they're like, oh, I didn't raise you to treat your child like this. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Don't lie. You're going to lie anyway, but whatever. One of the big things about preventing adverse childhood experiences is talking about it. You got to talk about it. You got to get it out there. You got to let people know what these are, because I think a lot of people feel like if they say they have a hard childhood, or if they say they had a hard childhood, that people may look at them like, what are you talking about? I mean, you know, you had a roof over your head. You weren't homeless, you know, or maybe you were homeless, but you stayed over different people's houses, so you were never on the street. And like, yeah, your parents beat you, but you weren't molested, you know, like, that's not what it's about. It's not about how things could be worse. It's about the fact that these things are adverse childhood experiences, and they can lead to trauma. They can lead to development issues. They can lead to mental illness issues and substance abuse issues. And like I mentioned earlier, even health issues like diabetes and cancer, you know. So you don't want to put so much stigma on it to where anytime someone brings it up, the parents or the family members immediately go into like defense mode, and they're like, oh, well, there's no way you could have ever possibly had a bad childhood. You know, really a bad childhood is subjective, because there are people who could grow up with all the money in the world, nannies, great education, private school, and they were still neglected by their parents, or they still end up getting abused in some way, you know, and that's valid. Like, those experiences are valid. I would never tell someone who went through some traumatic event, well, it couldn't have happened to you because you were rich. No, that's stupid. Come on, y'all. Don't be like that. So that's adverse childhood experiences. Now I want to talk about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. It's so hard to add the C on it. Like, you know PTSD very well, but you don't know CPTSD. And so a little quick thing about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Most people know what that is, but an example of it would be, you know, you're driving along, you know, and you're going through the intersection, and the light turns green, so you're going through the intersection, and somebody decides to run the light, they hit your car. Now you're in a car accident. Now you have to stop. I mean, if you can stop, who knows? You gotta get out. You gotta do all the different stuff with exchanging insurance and calling the police and filing claims and all of that stuff. That adulting, right? You go through all of that, and then, you know, if you can, you drive off. If you can't, you get your car towed, and you have to go through all of that. Now, a lot of people get into car accidents every day. Not every single person who gets in a car accident is going to experience trauma. It's not going to be a traumatizing event. But there are a lot of people who get into car accidents who it becomes a traumatizing event for them. And what this can show up as is you don't want to drive your car home. Even though you can drive your car home, you don't. You are so terrified and shooken up that you're like, if I get in this car, I'm going to get in another accident. And then, you know, the next day comes and the next day comes and the next day comes, you still haven't driven your car. You're terrified of driving your car. You don't want somebody to drive you somewhere because being on the road is terrifying. You can't go to work because even being on a bus is terrifying. You're just so afraid of getting in another car accident. You're having nightmares. You're having flashbacks. You hear a car horn outside and you're brought back to that day when that car hit you, and you just can't function because that scarred you so much. And there's no real way to tell if a event like that is going to be traumatic or not. I've been in a couple car accidents. The first one, I got over it. It took some time. Like, don't get me wrong, I was not over it the next day. It took like a week or two and me getting my car examined for me to make sure that my car, there was nothing wrong with it, that I wouldn't get into another accident. But I had a therapist, so I worked through it. The second time I got into a car accident was much more traumatizing in the sense that I was scared to even drive down that street again because I was so terrified that I would get into another car accident. It was a very difficult situation for me. And there's no real rhyme or reason to why that situation was traumatizing and not another situation. Like, or for example, you could have been in that car accident and you could have had somebody in the car with you, and that person's completely fine. They're like, "Oop, okay, we got a little fender bender, we got bumped, this whatever," and they go about their lives like normal. So you can't really predict if it's gonna be a traumatic experience or not. And that's just how life is. You know, you can't not go anywhere thinking that this might be the day you have a traumatic experience, because then you can't live your life like that. So that's kind of an example of what a post-traumatic stress disorder would be. And obviously your therapist would diagnose you and they would, you know, go through all these things to help you deal with that particular trauma, to help you get your life back on track. Now here's where it gets complex. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Matter of fact, let me give you the specific definition, okay? Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric condition caused by severe life-threatening trauma such as witnessing a death or a natural disaster or being in a car accident. Complex PTSD describes a much more severe and long-term condition that can occur after prolonged and repeated trauma, particularly in childhood. Trauma can cause problems with memory and disrupt the development of a person's identity and their ability to control emotions and form relationships with others. So, just to reiterate what that's saying, when you have a complex post-traumatic stress disorder, your trauma, you have more than one trauma, first of all, but then those traumas are stacked on top of each other. So a really good example of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, say you grew up in an abusive household and one of your parents was an alcoholic and the other one maybe did some other type of drug that they used to deal with the fact that their partner was an alcoholic. Just within that, there are so many things that can happen to you. You could witness domestic violence between your parents. That can be a traumatic event for you. You could be the victim of domestic violence from your parents or abuse from your parents, physically, sexually, emotionally, you know, psychologically. Those could all be separate traumatic events that stack on top of each other. You could be the victim of violence from one of your siblings who witnesses their parents being violent and decides to be violent with you, you know, and then you can go to school and you could be bullied severely, which could also cause traumatic events. And that bullying could stem from the fact that maybe your clothes weren't clean because your parents were too busy doing drugs to, you know, do your laundry, you know, and that's so many different traumas that can arise just in, you know, your childhood alone from just these two things of having parents who are in a very toxic relationship trickle down onto your kids. You can also have complex trauma where you are with someone who abuses you in different ways, and you could have one traumatic experience where maybe it's the first time they hit you. You can have another traumatic experience where you are out at a party and your partner shows up and they hit you in front of everybody else. That's another traumatic experience. You could have another traumatic experience when your partner decides that they want to sexually assault you. That's another traumatic experience. And that all can happen in the span of, a few weeks, a few months, a year, but they're all like stacked on top of each other. You don't just have this one trauma that your therapist is going to address. Say to get out my papers, what you doing? No, go over there. Go over there, baby. No, go over there. Stop trying to fight me. Give me this paper. So these traumas are all compounded together. So when you go to a therapist to address these issues, the therapist can't just pick out one specific situation when a traumatic event occurred and then just work on that. It's not going to work. They have, Sadie, no. It's not going to happen. They're going to have to break down this trauma, then this trauma, then this trauma, or maybe all the trauma stems from one inciting incident that they would have to focus on first. It's a lot more difficult to treat complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And let me talk about some of the symptoms. I got my paper here. Let me talk about some of the symptoms of complex PTSD. They are very similar to PTSD. So you have the inability to control emotions, periods of losing concentration, dissociation. Dissociation is kind of like when some people describe it as like feeling like they're outside of their body. You know what I mean? Like you're doing things and you're going around and moving around, but you don't really, your brain isn't recording it as if it's you doing these things. Your brain is kind of recording it as your body is doing it, but you're not there. So you might not even remember some of the things that you did just because your brain wasn't there. Blanking out or losing memories. Obvious one. Difficulties with a sense of identity or body image. So you might have people who are, they feel like they're too skinny. They feel like they're too fat. They might develop an eating disorder. Physical symptoms that can't be explained medically, such as headaches, stomach aches, dizziness, chest pains, inability to trust others, being vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, self-harm, not alive attempts, substance abuse, feeling ashamed or guilty, difficulty controlling emotions. Some people who so it says, what causes complex PTSD? Some people can have long-term childhood physical and sexual abuse. Another example is long-term domestic violence, something I brought up. Being a prisoner in a war camp or a concentration camp, something that's happening in America right now. Being in prostitution, being sex trafficked, being in a brothel, being in a organized child exploitation ring. Don't get the cute people in here. But the reason I bring these things up is because I don't think enough people talk about what complex post-traumatic stress disorder is and the effects it can have on your body. And if I recall correctly, it used to be in the DSM. And if it was still in the DSM today, it would probably be one of the most diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorders like ever, because there are so many people in the world. There's so many people in America alone who have experienced complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of it stems from, we have mass shootings. Those are traumatic events. Imagine being a kid in a school and you have multiple mass shootings at your school. Well, you don't even have to imagine. Some of these kids have gone through this, So those are multiple traumatic events. You've had, like whenever we go to war, you have people who have experienced multiple traumatic events in the war. You have people who've experienced traumatic events at their job where their bosses have been very, very abusive. People who've gotten into abusive relationships, people who've gotten into multiple abusive relationships. And all those different things come together to cause trauma. It's not just one bad thing happened and you should get over it now. Like, I feel like some people say stuff like that and it really pisses me off. It's that multiple bad things have happened and they've all compounded onto each other, and it creates a very, very difficult life. So part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this was because I have experienced a lot of adverse childhood experiences. You can go online and like take a test, and if you score above a certain number, it's likely you had a difficult childhood, if you want to call it that, instead of saying a bad childhood. I've taken a test. My sister's taken a test. We both scored I think we had the exact same score, which makes sense because we grew up together, but we scored very high. My therapist put me through a complex post-traumatic stress disorder test. I scored very high. She was not surprised at all, but when she gave me that diagnosis, I wanted to make sure. Like, I was like, can I have some kind of test, that would say for sure that this is what's going on with me? When looking back at it now, of course it is. I've had too many things. And one of the things that, I'm not going to go into much detail because, again, these are traumas. And traumas are very difficult to talk about when you haven't properly healed from them. And a lot of traumas I haven't properly healed from. But I can say, I've experienced a lot of abuse. And whether that's been from family or friends, all the different types of abuses, I've had those. I have an alcoholic father. I don't really know the nigga like that, but I have an alcoholic father who I was around in my childhood, who my siblings were around. Substance abuse is considered a mental illness in the DSM. He's a very angry, aggressive man who hates Black women. So that's an issue. I've had, my mother's dealt with depression. She's dealt with being a victim of domestic violence. That causes issues for her and for me. I have bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is usually genetic. I'm pretty sure there are other people in my family who have it. I think there's somebody in my family who might have schizophrenia. And drug use and alcohol abuse is very, very heavy in my family. A lot of people in my family love to self-medicate with alcohol or weed. So that's also a huge problem because we're not actually dealing with our issues. And when you don't deal with your issues, it causes more issues. So it's a lot of different things going on. And whether it's, cousins or aunts and uncles, they have trauma that they've gone through, because this is all a part of having a dysfunctional family dynamic. Multiple people are going to experience multiple traumatic events. And I've actually, before I started trauma therapy, did a trauma timeline. And that was a lot. Like, I was like, okay, so before I was born, this, and then after I was born, this. And I don't even think I put everything on that list. But when I wrote it out for my therapist, she was like, yeah, that's a lot. And I was like, I knew it was a lot. Everybody was acting like I was playing, And yes, I grew up in a poor Black community. Yes, I think that a lot of people who grow up in poor Black communities tend to downplay things that are mental health issues or trauma issues. So when you're in a poor Black community, it's very likely, like I said before, you're going to be around gang violence. You're going to be around, people robbing people's houses. You might be in a grocery store when the grocery store gets robbed. There might be a drive-by. You might hear gunshots a lot. You might have a high amount of alcohol abuse or substance abuse. You might get beat by your parents a lot. And then a lot of Black people will look at it like, oh, that's just what it's like being Black in America. Everybody went through that. So what's the problem? It's a lot of problems. The Black community has a really bad time addressing mental health because it's kind of seen as a white people thing. Or like if you end up going even to rehab, it's like, well, you must really be messed up if you had to go to rehab. No, you don't have to be super messed up. You can just say like, look, I got an alcohol problem. Look, I got a drinking problem. I got a smoking problem. I have an addiction to this or another. So when I started going to therapy, like I demanded to go to therapy. When I started going to therapy, people was like, it can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. You just overreacting to things. I was not overreacting to things. But it's easy to say that in the Black community because we don't want to address what the actual issues are and how certain things that have become standard practice in the Black community are contributing more to the problem. So I have an entire list of traumas that I have to work through. And one of the ways that I'm working through that, because like I said, I've been going to therapy for years. And when you get to the point where you've been in therapy for years and you're not making a lot of improvements, like you're meditating, you're exercising, you're eating right, you're doing all of these things and you're not really making an improvement, that's when you gotta get help. And like I mentioned with the bipolar disorder, I did have, I dealt with mania, I dealt with severe depression. I also deal with a lot of anxiety. I have symptoms of trauma like hypervigilance. I can't really trust people too much. I have to double, triple, quadruple check, make sure like all my doors are locked or like my doors are blocked at night. When I leave the house, I'm looking around trying to make sure nobody's trying to like rob me or hurt me. Even when it comes to relationships, I'm very, very paranoid, especially when I'm looking towards a relationship with a man, to make sure that this man is not going to abuse me. Like, he might cheat on me, but I need him to not hit me, because it's going to be a problem. Because there was a lot of physical abuse in my family growing up as well. And these are things that I just thought were normal. Like, I even had a psychiatrist who, he didn't even think that there was really a lot wrong with me outside of the bipolar disorder. He was just kind of like, oh, well, you high energy. And I'm like, nigga, I'm not high energy. I'm wired as fuck. Like, I'm always sensitive. Like, when I'm driving, like, yeah, defensive driving is normal, but I'm looking around, like, trying to see if, who about to try and crash into me today. And when I would have traumatic events, I could not handle them the way other people could handle them, because I've already had so many fucking traumatic events that are compounded upon each other that make it difficult for me to handle when new things pop up. So a lot of these things that, are on this paper, I have issues with body image. A lot of women do, but I have issues with that. I have a really bad memory prior to me going to college. So, and I try to explain this to people in my family because they don't understand. They think that I just wasn't paying attention. Like, I just can't remember. My memory of childhood events, it's either very, very skewed to where I remembered it a certain way because of how traumatic the event was, or it wasn't anything going on too serious to where my brain would even record it because my brain was so busy trying to remember all the fucked up shit that happened. There are some things that happened to me traumatically that I don't remember. My brain just said no, blocked it out. And I just but that doesn't mean that it doesn't affect me anymore just because I don't remember it. That's another thing that I think people think, is that if the kid doesn't remember it, then it's like it didn't happen. It still affects you, because when you're going through trauma and as a child, your brain is developing so fast. Yeah, your brain is going to want to protect you from something bad that happened, but also it's never going to fully throw that away, because everything your brain records is useful information. It helps you understand how the world is, and it helps you live your life. So maybe this person doesn't remember being abused in a certain way as a child, but their brain's going to hold on to those feelings, because when they get into relationships, their brain's going to be like, make sure this person doesn't abuse you. Do this, do this, do this, so that they don't abuse you. And the person may have no idea why they're acting like that in a relationship, because they don't consciously remember the trauma that they went through. But it's still there. It didn't go away. You didn't heal from it. And if you were to bring it up, or if somebody who knew that it happened to you were to bring it up and talk to you about it, you would find yourself very triggered and very uncomfortable. Another thing that I have as a symptom is difficulty breathing. So I've always been hard at breathing. It's not that I have asthma. I don't have asthma. It's purely psychological and trauma related. I just have a lot of moments where I just forget to breathe. And it's funny because when I was talking to my therapist, the trauma therapist that I'm working with, when we were working through a trauma, I was having pressure in my chest like I couldn't breathe. And then I remembered, how many times in the past several years have I been working with someone or talking to someone and they're like, Minu, breathe. Like, I just would stop breathing. I would just stop. There's no reason for it. I would just stop breathing. And I'm not exactly sure what trauma that might be related to. I'll figure it out as we get there. But I just wouldn't breathe. And it's so weird because people would tell me, they'd be like, it feels good to breathe, right? And I'd be like, yeah, it feels better to not breathe, which makes no sense whatsoever, but that's how my body is. I also have, and I was going to talk about this in another video, but that video getting pushed to the next video, but I've always struggled a lot with my period. I got my period when I was 8 years old in 3rd grade, very traumatic. All the kids was bullying me. They didn't know what it was. And I've always had really, really, really bad periods. Now, bad periods run in the family. We got fibroids and endometriosis, but I don't have either of those things. And I've been examined by gynecologist after gynecologist, and there is nothing physically wrong with me that causes my periods to be so bad. So the amount of pain that I am in with my periods, like I've, gone to the hospital over it. I've missed school, I've missed work. It's just so bad, and there's no physical explanation for it, because it's likely that is a part of my trauma. And I'm not going to get specific into which type of trauma, because I don't know just yet. I can make some guesses, but I'm going to leave it up to the trauma therapist to tell me. Sadie, why do you have to sleep on my paper? There's paper over there. Sleep on the paper over there. Get up. She mad at me. Sadie, give me my paper. Give me my paper, baby. Give me my paper. I talked about this in the bipolar episode, but I did struggle a lot with, self-harm and not alive and all of that stuff. Difficulty controlling emotions is another thing. It wasn't that I had like anger outbursts, and there are people in my family who do, but it was more of a kind of like a shutdown thing. My coping mechanism that I learned dealing with trauma was to just shut down, and because I guess somehow in my mind, if I didn't show any emotion, if I didn't react with any emotion, that would somehow protect me. But it doesn't, and it didn't. But it was a huge thing for me to just not do that. And so a lot of people thought, growing up, that I just didn't care about anything. And it's not that I didn't care. It's just like I needed to protect myself by, not being vulnerable, not allowing anybody in. And as I got older, that also manifested in the inability to trust people, because if everybody around you has hurt you, has rejected you, has let you down, why would you trust a new person? Why would you be vulnerable with that person, or even admit to caring about them being in your life, because they could hurt you at any moment? And I've come a long way because I've met people who are just super amazing, caring, loving people. But it still is something that I struggle with, especially when it comes to wanting to be in a romantic relationship with someone, because that's a lot of vulnerability you're going to have. And I don't think I'm ready for that. That's why I need to, I'm like, nah, let me work on myself for a minute. I gotta heal from some stuff. Definitely, I think my two biggest things is difficulty breathing, inability to trust others, and hypervigilance. I am always waiting for the punch. I am always waiting for, something bad to happen to me. If something good happens, it just means that I'm in between bad things happening. Like I might have a success, I might win at something, and I'll immediately start thinking about other failures that I've had, or when's the next problem going to happen. I may get the job that I like, and then immediately start thinking about how this job is going to go wrong, because I'm just so used to living in chaos that I can't feel too comfortable when things are okay. I don't know what it means to be okay. And I'm working on that. I'm working on having a better sense of safety. Right now, I don't really have it. And part of it's because I grew up in a poor Black community that had gang violence, but also because I grew up in a dysfunctional family that had domestic violence. So it's really, really hard for me to be in a situation where everything is okay, or I'm content, or I'm happy, because that's not how my brain is wired. So when you experience trauma as a child, your brain development literally changes, and your brain becomes wired for survival. And when your brain is wired for survival, that means that you are now learning how to survive in this very, very dysfunctional, chaotic environment. But then when you are out of that environment and you're in a nice, comfortable, normal environment, you don't know how to act because you weren't ready for this. So you end up being one of those children who doesn't really know how to interact with other kids. I had that problem. Had a lot of social anxiety, didn't know how to talk to people, didn't know how to make friends, because of the fact that my brain was just wired to not trust anybody because I needed to survive. And once I got out of a situation where I didn't need to survive anymore, I I didn't really know what to do. And that is something that regular therapy, it helped a little bit, but it really cannot fix that. Like, you have to go through a specific type of therapy to address those situations so that you can actually truly heal from them.